Hi everyone, I'm Joey. I know it's been a long time, somewhat of a long time since I've posted on YouTube. Well, I have been busy building this new workshop. Maybe at some point I'll do some kind of workshop tour majig. But the purpose of today's video is because I've just finished this lovely long table. It's 5.4 meters or so long, which is very long. But it can shrink down to about 2.2 meters. So stick around and let's see how I got this long table to be a short table. So whenever I have a project that relies on some kind of hardware, typically that's where I would start the job. Everything has to be built around the specifications of the hardware. In this case, with the sliding extensions, I'm making the hardware, so that's the best place to start. And from there I can kind of lay everything out around the extension slides. After preparing all the stock, in this case I'm using quarter sawn Victorian ash, I've put a groove on down the length of each side, and then I can glue in a tongue which will sit into the groove of the next piece it mates to. With all the pieces of the slides put together, it was just a matter of fine-tuning each of the joints, which is why you may have seen, or you will see, each piece is labeled either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or ABC, etc. Because each one is very slightly different. Each piece then received this wide T-style groove, and on the same side but slightly offset, a smaller, about a 6 or 7 millimeter groove that will house or enable the stop, the extension stop. I could then add on the opposite face a small steel pin which will slide in that groove you just saw. And then it's time to start assembling. First of all is to add a large washer at one end of all the slides. Then as you pull each slide out and it stops on the stopping pin, you can add the washer at the opposite end of that, and so now you have a washer at each end of each piece of slide with the stopper pin inside of all of that as well. I knew I needed to glue up some timber for the legs, so that's what I'm doing here. Glue and a couple of panel pins to hold it from squidging around in the press, and then off to my press. I've chosen to use a veneered MDF for the tabletop. I immed and ahed a lot about should we try and push for a solid timber top versus veneered. I've done this kind of tabletop with a solid timber before, and the wood movement becomes quite an issue. That's one problem. And also budget was really not on our side for solid timber. For the client to get the functionality that they wanted from this table, they were going to have to make some compromises with the construction somewhere, and I think this was probably the best place for the compromise to be. So with the veneered panel being 19mm thick, it's not thick enough. So what I'm doing is gluing on a piece of poplar plywood on the bottom of each of the tabletop panels, just to thicken it up. With the poplar being quite light, it really doesn't add much to the weight, although overall at the end there's a heck of a lot of timber in this table, and it is very heavy when it's complete, but that's a bit further down the road. So you can see that I cut my secondary top oversize, and then I can flush trim it down to size, and that way you don't ever have to worry about cutting two pieces exactly the same size and getting them lined up around the edges. Much easier to do it that way. Now the ends where the extension part meets in the middle need to be veneered, so I can do that with my little edging tool here. Okay, here's my tabletop with one of the halves. I've just milled down the solid ash for the edge, which I'm going to throw around like this. I've got this piece clamped up and the ends mitered. I'm going to mark out for the lamellos and then start gluing all these edges on. Sometimes if the lamello wasn't quite pulling in the edge piece of ash, you just add a clamp every now and then, but most of the time the lamellos would do the trick and I could move it around easily without clamps sticking out off the side of the pieces. I decided to add a slight bevel to the surrounding edge of the tabletop just to thin it down a little bit, create a little bit of a feature. So what that meant is I had to just plane away the bottom of the plywood thickening on the tabletop just to extend that bevel out. One quite nice advantage to using a veneered tabletop in this case is that we don't really have to worry about the wood movement at all of the tabletop. So when it comes to putting the aprons around the table, they can just be glued into place. We don't have to worry about things expanding and contracting, and it makes life a lot easier. In this case, these aprons aren't doing the traditional work of trying to keep a tabletop flat. Rather, they're there primarily in this case to hide the gigantic extension rails that are going to be attached to the bottom of the tabletop. With the aprons attached, I can focus back onto the tabletop and just clean up the solid ash border around the veneered panel. And then add a smallish roundover around the edge just to soften that sharp edge, and again to help reduce the visual thickness of the tabletop. So I laid the tops and the 4 leaves out on the ground just to see what the size of this table was going to be, and it turns out that the client had just emailed me and asked for a 5th leaf, which is why there is a gap on the ground. So I need to make a 5th leaf up at some point later and change the extensions. But before I get too carried away with that, I need to focus back onto the legs and work out how this thing's going to stand up. I decided on an 8-degree splay, a compound splay for the legs. So I'm cutting them to length here on the drop saw. I set up a pretty rough and ready jig to allow the Panto router to cut a compound angle. Well, it doesn't know it's cutting a compound angle at least. So then I can add a couple of tenons to the top of the legs. There we go. So you can see that those tenons are going to attach onto a board on the underside of the tabletop. With the tenons cut, I can make a very simple jig to put a taper on one side of the legs, and that's about them done. Okay, so I've set up the legs onto a piece of plywood for now. So I've mortised my plywood and the legs are just sitting down into that. So now I know that my Panto router is set up for that cut. Now I've just clamped on this stretcher here just so I can start working out the curve for, which way is it going to go? Yeah, this way maybe? It's going to curve this way. The main support, because this table is an extension table, it's going to be dragged forward and back all the time. So I need to stop these legs being ripped off. So I'm going to have a big curved stretcher, I guess it's going to be, angle brace. So I'm just going to try and work out how that's going to fit, how the joinery is going to work. Once I figure that out, I will record some more video. So with the room and the timbers I have, and the room I have, I can't make one sweeping arc through. So when you view the table side on, which is what you would be doing here, it would be nice if it was one continuous arc. That's not going to happen. I'm going to have some kind of, I guess, parabola shape. So I'm just going to make a series of arcs and then kind of marry them together as best I can. Okay, I've got a temporary plywood stretcher sitting here. I've got my kind of roughed out curve. I've roughed out some angles, how I think that's going to intersect here. Now that I kind of see how this is going to go together, I can remake my curve mold, and this piece I'm happy with. We'll change the shape a little bit. I've got the angles right. This piece I've got the angles right. Just need to change this intersection down here. So I'll do that and then we'll come back. Well, I'm not sure that I ever came back to my thoughts there, but what we're doing here is making the mortise for the stretcher between the legs and the tenon on the stretcher. You'll see that the tenon is quite far offset because most of this piece of timber is going to be cut away, but it's far easier to do all the joinery first with nice square stock before you start doing any fancy shaping or carving. Okay, got these angled stretchers, curved stretchers, pretty well shaped. They're 73 mil all the way through, and I want to taper it down so that where it meets the stretcher between the legs, maybe 50 mil, back up to 70. And because it's curved, there's no easy way to give myself a line to work to, so I'm just going to guess it, just using a pencil here, and I'll just gradually move the pencil away from my fingers, something like that. Right, now that I've got this piece sitting in place, this overhang here is 20 mil at this end, which means I can cut a 20 mil dovetail at that end and slide her into place, hopefully. There's always a way with dovetails, one chisel pass too much and you've got a slightly loose joint. I'm not too worried actually, because I'm using epoxy here, so I can get away with a slightly loose dovetail. The other one actually is very tight, so together I made two good joints. With the curved brace fitting on both stretchers, I could then cut and shape both of the stretchers. Using my old favorite ADOS, CRC ADOS builder's glue. See, it's two parts, just 50-50 by visual is fine. And it's a kind of an amber golden color, which is good for most timbers. But in this case, this whole base is going to be stained black. And I would like any glue lines, because I think there are going to be some glue lines. They can be black. So just use some black oxide. This is just an oxide that you can buy in a container this size it's actually for tinting concrete. But it works perfectly well for this kind of thing. So I'm only gluing up this connection. Everything else, this connection and the leg to the tabletop connection is all dry. I want to have this glued up so then I can carve and shape this connection when it's not on the table. And then once these two pieces are all shaped, I can carry on and glue up the actual legs. Okay, I mentioned earlier that the client asked to have an extra leaf in the extension table. So I've just made up an extra runner for each of the side extension rails. So they're all now working pretty smoothly. I'm just going to rub some beeswax, paste wax over the runners and get them nice and slippery. And then tomorrow this can all go together for its final time, and we may even attach them to the table. That would be nice. Okay, it's a couple days later. This glue is dry. So this is the bottom of the table, if it's not obvious. I've got a little piece of the curved stretcher coming up through the top, so I'm going to trim that off. And then where the dovetail is exposed here, I'm just going to freeform carve this stretcher down to somehow nicely meet with this. And then we'll take this whole thing out and flip it over and do some serious carving on the bottom side of this. Right, so I've got to get rid of all that and try and carve all this to make it marry into this part here, so fingers crossed. Oh, you may also notice I've glued on an extra block here because the dovetail from here is sticking out below the level of this piece of timber, so I've just glued another block on, and then almost all of that will be cut off, just leaving a little triangle in here once I carve all this around. Right, so the curved assembly brace is shaped, pretty well sanded up. I can start gluing on the actual base. So first is the base board, I suppose, and you can see the mortise holes there that the legs will fit into. So this is glued, screwed into position. As you've probably already seen, the base of this table is black. So I'm using a black dye stain rather than just a stain. So it's like a methylated spirits based product. So it dries, evaporates very quickly, which means we can essentially go straight on to a finish on top of this. By the time you've done your first coat of stain, it really is dry and you can just crack straight on with the next part of the job. And for us, that was using Osmo with a tinted black stain in it. So it just really deepens, richens up the blackness, and does the finish at the same time, which is great. So typically we just roll on our Osmo, and then with a damp cloth, when I say damp cloth, I mean it should be damp with Osmo. We're not trying to wipe it off, rather just get rid of the drips and blobs. So the battery died just while we were getting the black Osmo on. Anyway, didn't miss much more, just wiping on Osmo. Rolled it on, nice heavy coat, and then wipe off the excess. Most of this will just, under here, we'll just get one coat, and once the table's up the right way and assembled, I'll then look at the legs again and the aprons and possibly give them a very light sand because I don't want to remove any black. A very light sand with say 400 grit, and then a last coat that will probably buff in with a rag. She's feeling pretty nice right now. It's looking pretty nice. I'm glad to have it at this stage. So yeah, next stage is to get the runners situated in on the bottoms, get the table together upside down, and then somehow flip it the right way up, and make sure the leaves and everything work. So still a bunch of work. Oh, and I've got to make a fifth leg because this thing's now going to be 5.4 meters long. Probably going to need a fifth leg, so I've got to work out how to do that. So I shall go and think about that one. Okay, with the runners, this runner kind of sitting in its place, I just need to decide how I'm going to attach it here. I could use this shorter 65mm screw, which is safer but has less bite into the actual table frame. I could go up to the 75mm, which is much closer to coming all the way through, but much more meat in the timber, which I think is the one I'm going to go for. I'm confident of doing this. If you ever are in a situation where you really don't want to drive it too far and coming through, simply putting the screw on a bit of an angle just gives you an extra few mil here, and that can save yourself from coming all the way through. But I think I'll be right going straight through and just going dead flush here, and I've got a couple of mils to spare. I wanted to add a kind of a safety measure where the runners were secured to each other at each end. So made up another piece of timber which would screw into the rails or the aprons of the table, and then into the end of the rails where they could, depending on which end they're looking at. So after you reach about 1.8 meters span, anything longer than that, there is a bit of a sag in the extension system. That's just how it works. So obviously I mentioned before, I made up a fifth leg, which is just a piece of ash on a piece of oak. Now I don't like how the leg is inserted here, so I've changed that slightly. But other than that, the leg works super well and means you can jump all over the table and not have to worry about it. One of the last things to do on this table was just to add some positioning pins so all the leaves would meet up in the correct place and kind of tie into each other so they wouldn't flip off the table if you were to lean on or sit on the edge of the table. I'm just using dominoes for this job. I've done it this way before and it works really well. So one side of the leaf has a domino that is glued into place and the other side of the leaf has a slightly wider domino slot. And the only thing I do to help fit the dominoes is slightly ease them back with a file on the leading edge, just so they fit into the mortise a lot easier, because they are designed to be a tight fit and you don't want to have to hammer them into position all the time. Okay, slightly closer look at the fifth leg. It's just a piece of ash, good little extension adjustable foot on the end, and a piece of oak. Got some through tenons for the leg coming all the way through. I've got a stopper on one side. Before I had the stopper on both sides and it was just more difficult than it had to be to put the leg in. So now I think this is about as easy as it can be to add a fifth leg to something like this. The idea is put the leg in from the top, pop it in, slide it over. Seems to work quite well. And the last job is to finish the top of the table, which is going to be the grey graphite color Osmo product. So again, roll it on, wipe off the excess, and do that a couple of times. I think we put 3 or 4 coats on this top, and here she goes. She looks great.